So welcome to this second of our keynote lectures for March, Marx 1313. Today we'll be returning to Marx's 18th Brumaire, this time in conversation with Edward Said's 1978 book, Orientalism, and Jacques Derrida's 1993 book, Specters of Marx. It's a great privilege to welcome to Columbia and to New York City Guillaume le Blanc and Judith Revel, two brilliant critical philosophers who are both going to continue this conversation that we've been having about Marx's 18th Brumaire. Both of our guests this evening have thought extensively about the relationship between reading this text and current conjuncture. So we'll be intersecting it not only with the 1970s and the 1990s, but also with the events that are happening right now. Let me quickly introduce them both, and then Guillaume will kick us off with his presentation. Guillaume le Blanc is professor of philosophy at the University of Paris Cité and member of the Institut Universitaire de France. He is a philosopher who specializes in social philosophy, as well as a specialist of Michel Foucault, of Georges Canguilhem, and of French contemporary philosophy. If I recall correctly, you studied with Canguilhem, right? Tu avais travaillé avec Canguilhem, c'est ça? Right. Tu avais écrit ta thèse avec lui, c'est ça? Yeah, right. Guillaume le Blanc has written many books that have been translated in several languages, including Canguilhem et les normes, Les maladies de l'homme normal, La pensée Foucault, Canguilhem et la vie humaine, La philosophie comme contre-culture, La solidarité des éprouvés pour une histoire politique de la pauvreté, most recently in 2023. In all of those works, Guillaume le Blanc works on questions of norms, exclusion, on forms of resistance, especially among the most precarious. He's also published several studies on contemporary American culture and American literature, especially including that of Cormac McCarthy, Richard Ford, Russell Banks, and others. And in his paper today, he will be exploring the paradigm of social welfare in warfare in Marx, how class conflict is understood as a form of warfare. And he'll be reading it in conversation in part with Michel Foucault's use of the matrix of war to understand relations of power, and also in conversation with Edward Said's Orientalism. After he's done, and we'll have a short conversation about his paper, we'll turn to Judith Revel, who joins us also from Paris, and for a second time at this Marx 1313. It's a pleasure to have you back. Judith is a professor of philosophy at the University Paris I Panthéon-Sorbonne, and she's also a member of the Institut Universitaire de France. She is a philosopher who specializes in contemporary French political philosophy since 1945, and in Michel Foucault, but also Deleuze, Derrida, as well as Merleau-Ponty, Claude Lefort, Clastres, Costeriadis, Rancière, Agamben, Tony Negri, Roberto Esposito, and many others. Judith Revel has written several books, including Foucault, Expérience de la pensée, the Dictionnaire Foucault, Foucault une pensée du discontinu, the Dictionnaire politique à l'usage des gouvernés, and Foucault avec Merleau-Ponty, Ontologie, politique, présentisme et histoire. She has also directed the Italian edition of Foucault's Dit et Écrit at Feltrinelli. She's currently working on theorizations of the political before and after 1968, drawing on a comparative study of the political and intellectual projects of the journals Socialisme et Barbarie in France and Quaderni Rossi in Italy. And of course, she's worked extensively on contemporary regimes of governmentality, modes of subjectivation, and practices of resistance, as well as on the Italian readings of biopolitics and operarismo, which are all, I think, very relevant to what's going on today. And she will present a paper that puts Marx and Marx's conception of history and a way to think about history today in dialogue with Derrida's reading of Marx in Specters of Marx. So, we're going to start then with Guillaume le Blanc's paper. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So I begin my talk. Today, I'd like to reflect with you on the meaning we might give to the conservative revolution we're witnessing before our very eyes, which seems to be taking shape today right here in the United States with Trump's victory, in Argentina with Milei's, but also in Europe with the rise of what Alberto Toscano calls late fascism, or what Enzo Traverso calls post-fascism. The dangerous links between neoliberalism, neopopulism, and neo-fascism are in fact the subject of a seminar with Cynthia Fleury in Paris this year, and of a colloquium on the subject in December in Paris. This is, of course, a conversation that goes beyond Marx' 18th Brumaire, but one point seems to me particularly important. It concerns the meaning given by Marx at the end of his text to Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat and the role of the peasantry in supporting it. Etienne Baliba, recently invited to the Marx 1313 seminar, suggested a very interesting parallel between contemporary social discontent and the advent of authoritarian populism on the one hand, and the peasantry's role in supporting Louis Bonaparte on the other hand. During my talk, I'd like to explore this parallel and reflect with you on the link between social discontent, the need for revolution, and the production of a counter-revolution, which seems to me to underpin any analysis of a social warfare paradigm. If we take up the hypothesis Foucault calls Nietzsche's hypothesis in his 1976 lecture, society must be defended, according to which politics, as you know, is the continuation of war by other means, in fact, the invention of Clausewitz. The question that interests me is the following one. Is the outcome of social discontent necessarily a counter-revolution? We're living in a way in a period that is both pre-revolutionary and counter-revolutionary at the same time. Instead of leading to a radical questioning of the political and economic foundations of our social order, social unrest is leading to a conservative revolution in which the people give new credence to a leader, apparently naturalized by elections, but profoundly driven by a logic of conservation of a social body, of which he is, in a sense, the ultimate bulwark. How do these people, instead of emancipating themselves, reinforce their own servitude? It's a question that, philosophically speaking, has a whole history. Wilhelm Reich, in The Mass Psychology of Fascism, analyzes the rise of fascism in a series of texts written between 1940 and 1933. In his book, he asks why the German working class did not oppose Nazism when all the socio-economic conditions were ripe for workers' revolt against Nazism. Deleuze and Guattari, in L'Anti-Oedipe, took up his analysis and tried to provide an answer themselves. Adorno's work on the authoritarian personality also raised similar questions. But in a way, it was already Marx's question. Why did the people, in fact, support Louis Bonaparte? Yet, Marx's question itself needs to be clarified in the context of a very important dissociation central to 18th Brumaire between the proletarian class, which organizes itself as a revolutionary class, and the peasantry, which never manages to represent itself as a class. One is still in the minority in the eyes of the other, which is why the peasantry, by taking a stand in favor of Louis Bonaparte, completes the process of dispossession of a revolution carried forwards by the proletarian class and produces the counter-revolution. It seems to me, and this will be my hypothesis, that we would gain by transporting Marx's reasoning, which I shall first recall, to our own times on condition that we accept a certain parallel between the peasantry of the 19th century and today's precarious workers, including wage earners, the unemployed, part-time workers, and so on. This is the hypothesis recently put forward by Peter Gordon, the 18th, in an article, the 18th Brumaire of Donald Trump, that we can read recently. But first, it will be my first part. What has really written Marx on class warfare? How does Marx pose the problem? What does Marx, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, deal with? In this book, first published here in New York in 1852, then in France, Marx analyzes the coup d'etat of December 2, 1851, by which Louis Bonaparte, then president of the Republic since 1848, became Emperor Napoleon III, the third, and founding the Second Empire. Marx was not the only one to have written on the subject, as Victor Hugo's Napoleon le Petit, Napoleon the Small, and Proudhon's Le Coup d'État were also critically referenced in Marx's own work. At the start of his book, Marx draws a parallel between General Bonaparte's revolution on November 9, 1799, to become emperor and overthrow the Directoire, and Louis Napoleon's coup d'État, which he interprets as a parodic replay of the first coup. Marx's thesis is very simple in a way. He makes it clear in the foreword he wrote in 1869 for the German edition. I show, quotation, how the class struggle in France has created circumstances and conditions which have enabled a mediocre and grotesque character to play the role of hero. Thus conceived, this text extends Les luttes de classe en France, Class Struggles in France, published in 1850, and anticipates the publication of La Guerre civile en France, Civil War in France, in 1871, which deals with the Commune. These three books should be read together as a history of class warfare in France from the Revolution of 1848 to the crushing of the Commune in 1871. Here is a quotation, for example, a letter to Canguilhem, April 17, 1871, about La Guerre civile en France. Thanks to the struggle of the Parisians, the battle of the working class against the capitalist class and state has entered a new phase. Whatever the outcome, it's the conquest of a new starting point of universal historical importance. So, what is the historical context? On February 24, 1848, after 3 days of rioting, King Louis Philippe was ousted, and it marks the end of the July monarchy, marking the birth of a Second Republic. Universal suffrage was introduced for men over the age of 21, and elections to the Assembly were announced for April. The revolutionary movement was broken in May following the May 15 demonstrations. Then came the cold shower, so to speak. Dissolution of the national workshops on June 21, forcing workers to enlist in the army, repression by the Minister of War Cavaignac between June 24 and 26, creation of a party of order, which led to the election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte on December 10, 1848, and the party's success in the legislative elections of May 1849. Finally, in response to the risk of proletarian revolution, Napoleon's coup d'etat was supported by the bourgeoisie, which feared proletarian revolution. Class struggles in France analyzes the reasons for the defeat of the February 1848 revolution and the alliance between the bourgeoisie and the monarchy against the proletariat. The 18th Brumaire analyzes the coup d'etat of 1851 and the establishment of an empire with the support of the big bourgeoisie. In both cases, the history of French society is marked by the genealogy of class struggle in three phases: its possibility first, its impossibility even, and its necessity. First, its possibility and impossibility. This is due to the fact that, as Marx acknowledges, while the proletarian class allied itself with the bourgeois class to establish the bourgeois monarchy in 1830, and the republic surrounded by social institutions, so to speak, with a quotation of Marx in February 1848, the proletarian class was unable to emancipate itself from the bourgeois class and bring its own revolutionary interests to bear against it. Marx recognizes at the start of class struggle in France that the cause of the June 1848 defeat was the proletarian class's inability to follow its own revolutionary interests and then accomplish its own revolution against the bourgeois class. Yet, second point, this impossibility is precisely what gave the working class its future revolutionary strength. For by abolishing social institutions, the bourgeois class imposed a counter-revolution, the consequence of which was the emergence and universalization of a proletarian class in struggle against the bourgeois class. And this is precisely what the 18th Brumaire aims to analyze. The 18th Brumaire then serves two goals. On the one hand, it shows what the bourgeois counter-revolution consisted of, culminating in Napoleon's coup d'etat and the establishment of an empire. For it was the bourgeoisie that created the empire to escape the proletarian danger. Secondly, on the other hand, it shows how a counter-revolution is generated by the bourgeois counter-revolution insofar as the struggle of the working class against the bourgeois class is objectified and universalized in a picture that is not just French, but also European at the same time. In these various writings, which are in many ways a diagnosis of the present, Marx's way is forward a reflection on the present to which Marx himself belongs and which he intends to transform through his own analysis. It is thus the actualization of a logic of confrontation between classes that is restored by Marx. What Marx's three texts have in common and in the same historical coherence is the chronicle of the proletariat's foretold defeat with its transformation into a defeated class, but also its resurrection as a triumphant class driven by its revolutionary interests. The logic of history that Marx unfolds is that of a construction of a social war. Just look at, to remember at the first sentence of a Communist Manifesto. The history of every society up to the present day is the history of a class struggle. War lies at the very foundation of history and therefore of politics. The model Marx deploys is that of a battle between classes according to an agonistic model of struggle that eventually became binary, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The history Marx reconstructs is not one of distance, it's a history within the struggle that must be waged on the side of the proletariat. This is precisely what Foucault will call political historicism, in which politics is analyzed from the point of view of war, while at the same time the historian participates in the combat he describes. On the first side, the analysis of power relations must be conducted in terms of war. I refer to Foucault. The point is to understand how war is, quotation, an analyzer of power relations. On the second side, the historian is himself caught up in the battle. Here again, to quote Foucault, the historical knowledge of struggles is itself an element of the struggle. What I'd like to question in my talk is the meaning to be given to this social war as an extension of war, to the fact that war, to quote Foucault, begins to become the permanent social relation, the foundation of all relations and institutions of power. What significance can we give to this model of class warfare in interpreting our own world today? But first, how are we to understand this history of class struggle in Marx's various texts on France? As much as the manifesto is written from, and it's a very important point, from the point of view of the inescapable victory of the proletarians over the bourgeoisie, to be consecrated, as we know, by the advent of communism, Marx's texts on France are written from the point of view of the defeat of the proletarians. As Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval write in their book on Marx, grappling with facts that diverge quite markedly from the triumphant proclamations of the manifesto, will try to understand the dynamic that led to the revolutionary fiasco. What Marx analyzes is the establishment of a counter-revolution, but this counter-revolution must itself be defeated by a future of a revolution. How can a proletariat revolution emerge from within the bourgeois revolution, which confiscates it in the first instance, but precipitates it in the second instance? Marx writes at the time of the bourgeois counter-revolution that opposes the proletarian revolution, but at the same time, he shows that the establishment of this counter-revolution, the establishment of the empire that serves the bourgeois revolution, is what will make the proletarian revolution possible and necessary. By deepening the war between the bourgeois and proletarian classes, hitherto masked in the event of the bourgeois revolutions. Marx's analysis in the 18th Brumaire follows this logic. The advent of the social republic of the February days is fatally opposed and defeated by the establishment of a bourgeois republic. One sentence seems to me particularly important, quotation. The defeat of the June insurgents had certainly prepared and smoothed the ground on which the bourgeois republic could be founded and erected. But at the same time, it had shown that in Europe we are dealing with issues quite different from the dilemma of republic or monarchy. It had revealed that bourgeois republic means here the unbridled despotism of one class over other classes. Two elements are, for me, fundamental here. First one, the crushing of a social republic by the bourgeois republic signifies the definitive end of a synergy of working class and bourgeois interests against the monarchy. Second point, what is revealed is not the institution, political struggle between the monarchy and the republic, but rather the economic class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It was on this new basis that the bourgeoisie formed an alliance with the monarchy, creating the Party of Order to counter the proletarian threat. But this could only be achieved if the big bourgeoisie freed itself from the petty bourgeoisie and maintained domination from above. An ideological synthesis develops with the creation of a Party of Order, uniting property, the very large, family, religion, and order, against what Marx interprets as, I quote, the party of anarchy, socialism, and communism, according to a model of class struggle that emerges as such. But the very thing that led this Party of Order to side with Napoleon in 1851, in order to avert the proletarian threat once and for all, was to make the working class, in fact, more conscious, to endow it with its own language, and thus make it truly revolutionary by universalizing it. Hence, I would like to draw a parallel in my second part of my talk between this situation described by Marx about the role of peasantry according as a kind of a way to support Louis Bonaparte, and perhaps what we could say today, with, of course, precautions on precarious workers and the function, the role of supporting some kind of authoritarian people. In the final chapter of the 18th Brumaire, a very important one, chapter 7, Marx analyzes the fundamental role played by the peasantry in supporting Louis Bonaparte. Without whom Bonaparte could not have succeeded in his coup d'etat. In short, Louis Bonaparte relied on a majority of the people, a silent majority, the peasantry, who did not constitute themselves as a class, and ended up preventing the working class from becoming revolutionary. Marx's argument is very interesting and important. It goes as follows. The French bourgeoisie, by focusing on the enemy constituted by the proletarian class, brought to power the unorganized mass of the peasant people represented by Napoleon. Quotation from Marx, Bonaparte represents a class, indeed the most numerous class in French society, the parcel peasants. In fact, the creation of universal suffrage in 1848 sealed the victory of the cities over the countryside and exacerbated peasant discontent. Bonaparte relied on them to carry out his own coup d'etat. The counter-revolution is first and foremost that of a victory of those who felt defeated by the advent of the bourgeois republic. The petits paysans, who Marx tells us constitute an enormous mass and whose members all live in the same situation. Marx insists that these peasants live in the same situation, yet are not in contact with each other. It's a very important point. And are not in position to form a truly organized class with common interests. What Marx describes are conditions of extremely precarious autonomy, where each peasant is rifted to his own plot of land in order to survive, without any outside input or the slightest organic solidarity in the division of labor. Quotation, their field of production, the plot of land, does not permit, in order to be cultivated, any division of labor, any application of science, hence no diversity of development, no variety of talents, no richness of social relationships. Each peasant family is more or less self-sufficient, producing most of what it consumes itself, and thus earning its livelihood in exchange with nature rather than in trade with society. End of quotation. Marx describes a form of sober autarky imposed by the working conditions of a small peasantry. He pays close attention to the self-sufficiency that creates the illusion of relative autonomy, the main fear of which is precisely that this autonomy could be lost. Marx also emphasizes the extent to which France is made up of an unorganized mass of peasants. This mass can be thought of as a class in a way, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be, according to Marx. It forms a class, so to speak, because its economic conditions and interests are common to millions of families and are opposed to the interests of other classes. But at the same time, and Marx is very clear on this point, it's not a class insofar as the interests of small farmers remain local, never organize themselves into a national political community, and never form a political party with its own organization. It is at this point that the famous formula comes into play, and I like to quote it in full. The text of Marx here is very important and famous. They do not, writes Marx, constitute a class. This is why they are unable to assert their class interests in their own name, either through a parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, so they must be represented. At the same time, their representative must appear as the master, as a superior authority, as an unlimited governmental power that protects them from other classes and dispenses rain and shine from above. The political influence of small farmers thus finds its ultimate expression in the fact that the executive power subjugates society. Historical tradition led French peasants to believe in the miracle that a man named Napoleon will bring them glory. And an individual has been found who pretends to be this man because he bears the name of Napoleon. End of quotation. It is in this passage that we understand how the conservative counter-revolution, I think, takes place, which holds, according to Marx, that I quote, the election of December 10, 1848 was only completed by the coup d'etat of December 2, 1851. End of quotation. The proletarian revolution of 1848 actually brought to power the bourgeoisie, which split with the proletarian class because it began to fear it and turned back to the monarchy. And this synthesis of the big city bourgeoisie, the industrialists, the Orleanists, and the legitimists was perceived as a threat to the small peasantry. Bonaparte exploited this threat by establishing himself as the representative of the peasants and carrying out the coup d'etat in their name, even if it meant leaving the previous power relationships, hierarchy and domination unchanged. We need to understand why the peasantry sided with Bonaparte. Marx analyzes this point at length. He points out that peasant insurrections in the 18th century were put down by incarceration and deportation. He also points out that Bonaparte valued the conservative peasant attached to his plot of land over the revolutionary peasant ready to lose it and who allied himself with the people of the cities. Finally, Marx points out that during the 3 years of the Republic, 1848-1851, the Republic's political measures revived the peasants' revolutionary spirit, even if superficially, through uprisings that ended in bloody repression. The result was a peasant hatred of a national assembly that Napoleon was able to exploit. At the same time, Marx analyzed the achievements of the 1789 revolution and its Napoleonic legacy for the peasantry. As Marx points out, the revolution of 1789 transformed semi-serfs into free land owners of small plots, and Napoleon I, made it easier for them to exploit the soil. But with the pauperization of small peasants, largely brought about by rising taxes and their indebtedness, the status of a small peasantry became precarious. And it was this peasant precariousness that the second Bonaparte made use of. By defending the Napoleonic idea of peasant property, he became the representative of the peasants to the point where they supported him en masse after the coup d'etat. So, while the bourgeoisie had to relinquish political power by having Bonaparte elected in order to consolidate its economic power, as Marx clearly shows this point, Bonaparte instituted the coup d'etat by relying on the peasantry while preserving the economic interests of the bourgeois class. As Marx points out in a summary sentence, Bonaparte would like to appear as the patriarchal benefactor of all classes. What can we conclude from this analysis of the 18th Brumaire? I believe that Marx's quotation can be taken in two different directions for our own present. First one, it seems clear to me that there is a strong link between the support of a small peasantry for Bonaparte and the contemporary support of a section of the salaried workforce for authoritarian leaders in a post-fascist populist tradition. Of course, we will need, I don't have time to give attention to this argument, but we will need to historicize and contextualize. What's happening in France, for example, is not what's happening here. The social properties of some are not the social properties of others. For France, I'm thinking of Robert Castell's analysis of social insecurity when he points out that in France, social security has been thought of as a set of social properties available to wage earners and as the equivalent of a small property that confers autonomy on the individual in Locke's scheme. But precisely when the social state no longer seems to fulfill this function of securing social properties, when the fear of being downgraded, of being precarized, takes precedence over the reality of social insecurity, isn't it then that a non-progressive theory of social discontent can operate, which could be captured by an authoritarian personality, giving the impression to all wage earners still endowed with social properties, but living in fear and in the reality of downgrading, that they will once again be, if not protected, at least taken into consideration. As for the United States, we may well ask whether the function of the illegal immigrant is not precisely to establish a discourse of social insecurity for average white men and thus make possible the advent of an authoritarian personality. In any case, the prerequisite for this conservative counter-revolution to come to power is precisely that the silent majority does not find a way to organize itself, to represent its own issues independently of an outside leader, to take its own voice. Hence, to conclude my second direction, we find, and it's a very remarkable point, we find it in the margin of Said's book, Orientalism, published in 1978, where he quotes the phrase from the 18th Brumaire about the peasants in the title of his conclusion. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. What does Said mean? In his book, Orientalism, Said analyzes the way in which the West has manufactured the Orient, essentializing it and making it over. Said shows, for example, that Bonaparte took on board a group of Orientalists with him at the time of the war to conquer Egypt, the lone wing of the army, as Said calls it. The East is thus annexed through knowledge by the West, which disposes of it through power. What Said is questioning is quite literally the West's seizure of power over the East through knowledge, the discourse of truth that the West holds on the East, fabricates it as the East, but places it, of course, in a position of domination. Quotation of Said, Orientalism has more value as a sign of European and Atlantic power over the East than as a truthful discourse on it. What opens up in Said's reasoning is precisely the construction of a figure of subalternity, whose condition is not to be able to speak for oneself, and thus to be spoken for by the other, who assigns you to the other's place. Said's quotation of Marx posits that in colonization, it is the colonial relationship that creates the condition for the silencing of the colonized population by colonial knowledge power, whereas Marx rather implied that it was the peasants themselves who refused to organize themselves into classes and thus placed themselves under a master. Of course, Marx's peasant is not Said's Oriental man, for the latter is defeated in advance of his ability to speak by colonial knowledge, which functions always as power. Said echoes Fanon's analysis of the otherness essentialization of the figure of the colonized by colonial knowledge. If we think of colonial psychiatry, for example, and in particular l'école d'Alger, the Alger school, which defined in its own psychiatry types of criminality and delinquency specific to the Algerian race. Can we not then, that will be my conclusion, can we not then read and interpret the quotation from Marx in Said's text as a radical element of a theory of social discontent, the condition of which is the imposition of silence as a political proposal for the alteration of subalterns? Wouldn't it be a good starting point to propose within the framework of Marx's interpretation that one of the conditions of social war, and more precisely of social discontent, at the origin of free submission to a leader is precisely this silence imposed on the most precarious. Isn't the condition for a class not to represent itself precisely the imposition of a language to speak to it in a set of representation that in fact fabricate and alter it always from the outside? If this is the case, then free submission, so to speak, of course, to a leader will be perhaps the paradoxical desire to regain one's voice by conferring it on an authoritarian figure who is supposed to express it. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Guillaume, for that paper. And before we move to Judith, I think we'll just have a little bit of a conversation so that we can kind of keep the paper in our minds as we listen to Judith, and then bring it back up again. And so I wanted to start by asking you, Guillaume, about the question of, I think what your paper raises is, at its heart, a question about false consciousness and about the whole framework of involuntary servitude. So on page 2 of your paper, you really do bring in the idea of involuntary servitude. I mean, thinking of La Boétie, instead of emancipating themselves, they reinforce their servitude. And of course, you also bring in the critique of that and the critique of false consciousness from Reich and Deleuze and Guattari, etc. But that seems to be a very important question that's lurking in the paper and in the proposal and in the reading of Said. And so the question really is, to what extent do you want to buy into an element of false consciousness or ideological error? How much of that are you buying into, and how much are you rejecting? I mean, I personally don't buy into it for the moment, for this present moment. So I'll tell you my priors, but
yeah, of course.
But I mean, I hear it in your piece when you talk about kind of free submission to the leader. I still feel as if there's a strong dimension of false consciousness, of error on the part of the precarious classes, the workers, the MAGA base, in a way, that I think is who you're referring to here. Now, I think that Edward Said raises a different problem, because his work, I think, is a construction. I mean, it's the external construction of this, right? And you say construction. This is the construction of a figure of subalterity, right?
Yeah.
But not necessarily what is actually going on. And I mean, so, and in that context, I think we could bring in Gayatri Spivak's discussion of representation in Can the Subaltern Speak? I mean, with Said, I get the sense that it's not, that is the construction of the way the West has created this and tried to impose particular power knowledge framework, but that's not necessary, but that tells us nothing really about the way in which persons who are living in l'Orient, in the Orient, are actually acting themselves. Maybe Marx was wrong about the peasants in a way, in thinking that they weren't representing themselves. But certainly today, I think in our present context, I don't think we would want to go down that path of suggesting, for instance, that precarious workers are, you know, only kind of freely submitting to a leader, when in fact it seems as if there's a real self-consciousness, right? Represented, for instance, and articulated by someone like Steve Bannon, for instance, and Breitbart and that whole machinery. So that would be the question, I think, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernard. It's a very important, and in fact, it's the most important question that we can, I think, put on my own talk. Just to, in order to perhaps that we should remember for the next questions and the following discussion, I would say that the first point, I'm trying to give some arguments. First point, Marx needs to build a strong concept of class, and one of the main conditions of the possibility to be a class is that this class has its own voice. It seems to me very clear that the proletarian forms, that the working class forms a class insofar as it has the possibility of develop its own voice against the bourgeoisie class and other classes. And the fact is that it doesn't find such argument in the conditions of life for the small peasants. I mean, not all the peasants are involved in the argumentation of Marx. Only the peasants that are small peasants that possess a small part of land and that live in a certain sense, whose life is devoted to survive, to create a possibility of autonomy, of precarious autonomy. And Marx insists on that point that each family of peasants is devoted to this point, so that no one can see what the other peasant is making at the same point, because all the energy of life is taken into this capacity of surviving. That's the point. But this point is very important for me, because when I refer, second observation, when I refer on Said's interpretation of this sentence of Marx, of course, the epistemological frame is not at all the same. The epistemological frame of Said's analysis in his book is, in a certain sense, an epistemic construction in the way that Said shows how the East is fabricated by the West as an epistemological category that summarizes by advance all the possibilities of life when we are taken in this category of Orient. What forms for me a bridge between the argument of Marx's class and the argument and the epistemological of the political arguments of Marx's class and the epistemological argument of Said, what forms the bridge for me is the presupposition. And in fact, my paper is a radical critics of this presupposition. The presupposition that, of course, people are unable to speak by themselves, either because they are taken by events into economic considerations that exclude for the possibility of having their own voice, or either because they are taken into an epistemological category that will make unable the possibility to speak. And of course, Spivak has clearly, she has taken the same sentence of Marx, and she has clearly established that we always speak for the other, and that we never let the other speaking, even if the other is criticizing the way we speak for the other. And it appears to me that this argument is really, can be really deepened by the reflections that Said develops. Of course, the reflection he develops are epistemological, but I think there is a naive epistemology we could find in other texts, of course, of Bourdieu, for example. I think of his many texts on poor people, where he says some definitive sentences from which are really that are really terrific sentences from a scientist's point of view, saying that the poor, the excluded people, cannot represent himself the future because he is dispossessed of social conditions of temporality. And this kind of sentence, I think, is quite negative. And I tried, by contrast, in my own presentation, to pay attention to the fact that there is a kind of, free expression by the people in choosing their own chief, so to speak. And this is the paradox that Wilhelm Reich had clearly pointed at the beginning of his argumentation in his famous, in these famous reflections directly produced by the arrival of Nazism. And so you spoke of, just to conclude, to finish, you spoke of la Boétie, la servitude volontaire. And yes, I think we have to penetrate this black box of willingness, of consciousness, if we want today to understand perhaps more in a non how to say, in a non-superiority way to speak, if we want to to understand why people choose a chief that will be a disaster for them and not a liberation. I think it's very important to put into consideration this black box of psychic life, and that's why that's what I tried to explain in a certain sense.
Okay, good. So we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this because I mean you still do kind of hold on to this notion, which is, I think, fundamentally a notion of false consciousness, in saying that this goes against, say, their interests, right? And that's what I'm not sure about today. I'm not sure. Maybe I've always had a problem with that idea of being able to identify someone else's interests, but particularly in the present moment, I'm concerned about that. It was in part, and in part this is interesting because it really does bring us back to our last seminar on the 18th of Brumaire, where Marcuse also was very explicitly contesting notions of false consciousness, notions of ideology, in certain passages where he was also like not prepared to assume that people are acting against their own interest, or reluctant to think that it's always the other person who's acting against their own interest. So that I think is going to be a real source for us to continue the conversation. But let me bring in Judith, who is going to help us think about this through the lens of history now, and in a way the different historical moments of the present and the actual, and and the future. So with Derrida, welcome and thanks, Judith.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to attend this seminar for the second time this year. First time in Paris and the second this evening. I'm very honored and very happy. It is quite moving and impressive too to discuss here in New York, Marx, 18th Brumaire, in the city where the text was published exactly 173 years ago. As there has already been a session devoted to the same text for this Marx 1313 series, I will probably begin by explaining the meaning of my intervention and the direction I would like it to take. Much has been said about the commentary of the coup d'etat of December 2nd, 1851, and the way in which Marx wrote his text in immediate reaction to the facts between December 1851 and March 1852. There are generally at least 3 points that are made, and Guillaume has already spoken at length about some of them. First, regarding the famous opening sentence which, referring to Hegel, splits or perhaps doubles any great event into a great tragedy and a miserable farce. Second, the way in which the text, extending the analysis proposed in the class struggles in France, reads the very moment of history from a class dynamic, or more exactly from class antagonism, which become the key to understanding the period 1848, 1851, but which more generally sets forth a general model for understanding history. Third, the way in which the specific analysis of the peasantry, incapable of constituting itself as a class and reduced to being, I quote Marx, the simple addition of homologous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes, played into the hands of the bourgeois order. However, I would like to propose another reading, partial, perhaps even biased. This reading would, in fact, emphasize the complex conception of history that can be read between the lines in the 18th Brumaire. And since the seminar rule is to rely on a commentary, the reading I have chosen is that of Jacques Derrida in Specters of Marx, published in 1993. A word, too, about the choice of this book of Derrida. I'm perfectly aware of the discussions and objections that arose after the book was published, discussions and objections to which Derrida himself responded in 2002 in Marx and Sons. These are absolutely fascinating debates, but they are not the subject of my talk today. What interests me is something both smaller and more general. How Derrida's book, and especially its chapter 4, in the name of revolution, in the revolution, the double barricade, impure history of the ghosts, deduces from the Marxian text, or perhaps constructs within it, a representation of history that is worth considering. These are, without a doubt, many elements in this interpretation that resonate with my own research. I'm, in fact, currently working on a kind of mapping of the way in which some contemporary philosophers have thought history and regimes of historicity. And beyond that, I'm trying to understand how these representations of history, which are sometimes totally different from one another, determine political thoughts and thoughts of the political, which are in turn different, but which makes up a certain constellation. Well, I will, as usual, proceed point by point. I will also, as usual, apologize for my English and hoping that it will remain comprehensible. And then, of course, again, a huge thank to Bernard and to Columbia University and to you all who are here this evening for making this shared discussion and reflection space still possible. And I think it's not so easy today. So 5 points. The first point concerns the philosophical nature of Marx's political and sociological text. That is to say, the refusal to oppose sociological text on the one hand and philosophical text on the other. The statements of a principle is not a matter of inconsequence, because it is the very condition of possibility of my own reading of the Eighteenth Brumaire, and it is also that of Derrida's reading in chapter 4 of Specters of Marx. One could, of course, put forward other principles of distinction, but I think that Derrida would doubtless refute them in the same way. There is no need to oppose theoretical text and text of circumstances, analysis and chronicle, the conceptual Marx and the Marx journalist of his own time. The refusal takes the form of a long footnote in Specters of Marx, mentioning the distinction made by another French philosopher, Michel Henry, between Marx's philosophical text and those which, like the 18th Brumaire, are supposed to have less philosophical value. Derrida refutes this kind of dividing line. For Michel Henry, the political text or historical political text do not in themselves carry the principle of their intelligibility. The 18th Brumaire or the manifesto of the Communist Party are therefore immediately considered as a kind of extra philosophical material. And in the particular case of the 18th Brumaire, this quasi-devaluation of the text is further aggraved by the circumstances of its writing. After all, it is a text written for an American journal, which is not so noble. But with Derrida, on the contrary, the distinction has no place. The 18th Brumaire also talks about what? About something else. And this something else is essential. I quote Derrida, "One must take another step. One must think the future, that is life." And it's, of course, this mention of the future and this mention of life that interests me here. Second point, if historical sociological analysis has something as a philosophical dignity, then my second point relates specifically to the constitution of the present as a philosophical object. Here, I must confess what resonates with my own reflection. I, as a reader of Derrida, himself a reader of Marx, it's a kind of eco-phenomenon that is both foreign to Marx and Derrida, but which drives my interest. This eco is the way in which Foucault, at the very end of his life, seems to distinguish the present, le présent, on the one hand, and what he names actuality. I know that actuality is not so obvious in English, but actualité in French, on the other. The present seems to be understood as the set of present determinations that make the world what it is. That is to say, the sedimented set of present condition of our historical experience, and the way in which this sedimentation seems to trace in advance the field of our possible experience. The present is the effective state of the world at a given moment, insofar as it is historically determined, present. But actuality, on the contrary, is something else. With the word actuality, Foucault sometimes seems to want to designate what breaks or overflows or exceeds the system of determinations that shape the world as we know it. Actuality is rooted in the present, but it represents at the same time its denial. Actuality introduces something as a difference into it, what Foucault calls a possible difference, une différence possible. And while it is not irrelevant that Foucauldian reflection is based on Kantian texts, and while the importance of what is enlightenment for Foucauldian reflection in the very last years of his work has rightly been emphasized, it should be remembered, however, that in at least one of Foucault's commentaries, the reference to Kant is, so to speak, split or redoubled. There is not only one text, what is enlightenment, but actually two texts. And the system that these two texts form is fascinating in itself. This second text is the conflict of the faculties. If I insist on this point, it is because it seems to me that the splitting of the Kantian reference literally mimics the distinction proposed by Foucault between the present and what he calls actuality. Between 1784, what is enlightenment, the date of the first text, and 98, the date of the second. Between the two, something did, in fact, happen. And that something was the French Revolution. The revolution rooted in a present that gave it the opportunity to emerge, that gave it its form, that nourished its aspirations, and yet the revolution overflowing on all sides the realm of the imaginable or the prefigured in favor of an opening up of history, of a novelty, of the establishment of a possible difference. If I recall all this, it's not only because I have the pure pleasure of quoting Foucault, but because the question seems to me to be exactly the one that lies at the heart of Marx's reflection in the 18th Brumaire. Or at least it is the question of that, the question that Derrida identifies as central in the reading he proposes of the text. Let us draw the consequences of this. If we want to assert that the present is a philosophical object, we are inextricably bound to a dual level of analysis, which is both totally complementary and radically divergent. A mapping of present determinations on the one hand, and a tracing of possible differences on the other. To put it even more briefly, history as a system of determinations, and history as an opening up to what he doesn't contain. What is fascinating is that Marx does not propose, and neither does Derrida in his commentary, an opposition between history, understood as a place of determinations, and an outside to which it would be a question of giving the features of an exteriority to history, of a total strangeness, a thought of utopia, for example. Here, it is in history conceived as a milieu that we must situate ourselves. The game is played in history. But this double register of analysis, with the violence of the contradictions and conflicts to which it gives rise, corresponds in reality to a double regime of description. This double regime will be explained by means of a double and very divergent reference to spectrality. The parodic, heavy, paralyzing spectrality of a past that keeps coming back to haunt our aspiration for a change and our desire for revolution, on the one hand, and then the revolutionary spectrality, that is the opening up of history to what it does not contain, and that points to the future on the other. Specters of Marx, in the plural, we have two of them. And I can tell you right now that there will be a third kind of spectre. Third point of my commentary. Let us focus on the first of the two possible faces of, or sides of spectrality. The regime of deadly, toxic spectrality, that of parodic reprise, that of parodic revival, when events and characters are repeated and return in a caricatured and degraded form. This is the well-known opening of the text. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. End of quote. But the greatness of Marx's analysis is that he does not assign this parodic reiteration to the only logic of power. The deadly spectrality is not only the way in which December 2nd, 1851 reenacts November 9th, 1799, that is the 18th Brumaire of year 8, the way in which the coup d'etat of Napoleon the Little, since he violated the constitution of the Second Republic, of which he had nevertheless been elected president, reproposed in his own way the overthrow of the Directory, which has turned the Republic into the empire more than half a century earlier. Marx's greatness lies in considering that this deadly spectrality could also affect revolutionary events themselves. Revolution, like all events, sediment and accumulate and form a history, a liability, a weight, a heaviness, which keeps coming back. And Marx, from chapter 1 of the 18th Brumaire, is perfectly explicit in this respect. I quote, "The tradition of all dead generation wait like a nightmare on the brains of the living." End of quote. The tone of this statement, almost Nietzschean by anticipation, has the merit of formulating the great difficulty that lies at the heart of any revolutionary process. Of course, a revolution, because it always arises at a certain point in history, must come to terms with a series of determinations that have represented at the same time its own condition of possibility and its limitations, its causes and its obstacles, the deepest roots and that against which it stands. A revolution breaks away from, it stands up against. But it must also deal with the stratification of revolutions and events that preceded it, and which constitute, even more than an imaginary, the already effective and always limiting identification of the field of possible experiences. This is exactly what I have proposed to call, with Foucault, the present. The whole of present historical determinations, including past revolutionary experiences, which constantly shape in advance what would like, on the contrary, to present itself as actuality of the revolution. It is therefore a question of freeing oneself from the weight, because, as Marx writes, if, I quote Luther, put put on the mask of the Apostle Paul, the revolutions of 1789, 1814, wrapped itself alternately in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793-95. The actuality of the revolution as actuality, supposes that it succeeds precisely in overflowing, in exceeding the historical sedimentation which nevertheless forms its basis, because it has already taken place. When Marx says that, I quote, "The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future," end of quote. It is this tension that he identifies. Of course, he immediately understands that the temptation to borrowing from them, that is, the figures of the past, names, battles, slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language, that this temptation is all the greater when one finds oneself in a moment of crisis. And that the crisis, that is to say, etymologically the possible bifurcation, is precisely the possibility of the revolutionary event itself, Marx comments, and just as they, the revolutionaries, seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirit of the past to their service, end of quote. Marx, therefore, gives this first side of spectrality a very specific identity. The first side of spectrality is backward-looking fetishism. It is the set of great narratives of revolutionary hagiography. It is heritage and tradition, filiation and continuity. And Derrida, in his commentary, calls, therefore, for the exact opposite, the virtues of anachronism. One must recall the haunting reprise in Derrida's text of Shakespeare Hamlet's quotation, "Time is out of joint." Time is out of joint. More, the disruption, the disadjustment, the word is one of Derrida, or what Derrida calls the revolution within the revolution. No more revolutionary memory. Down with the monument. Bring down the curtain of the shadow theater and funerary eloquence. Destroy the mausoleum for popular crowds. Shatter the death masks beneath the glass caskets. All of that is the revolution of the past, end of quote. However, it would be wrong to imagine that simply breaking the revolutionary idols, being aware of the great narratives of a revolutionary counter-history that has itself become monumental history, in short, making a clean sweep of that past too, is enough. In any case, the solution is not the rejection of history. It is not the choice of ahistoricity, because an event is never outside history. Because what I have proposed to call, as Foucault at the end of his life did, actuality, actualité, is never done without a certain relationship to the present. Because there can be no difference without a careful survey of the effective determinations of our own historical situation. And these are only the very latest layer of a stratification to which we give the very name of history. With Marx, there is no way out of this split historicity constituted by the tension between the present and actuality. And it must therefore be confronted as such. When, for example, in the 1868 preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, Marx refers back to Victor Hugo and Proudhon. It is because in both their cases, and despite the difference of their respective texts, Napoleon the Little and Le Coup d'État, the understanding of what happened has, so to speak, shifted. They both, Hugo and Proudhon, moved from the register of history to that of the historical character. In Hugo's case, it is not the historical event that is confronted because, as Marx remarks, he sees in it only the violent act of a single individual, end of quote. In Proudhon, the apparent attention to history is not real either. His historical construction of the coup d'etat becomes a historical apologia for its hero. With Derrida, the ambiguity is greater than with Marx. I quote, "What does not happen in this anachrony?" He, Derrida himself, notes in the first chapter of Specters of Marx. But he adds immediately, perhaps the time, in English in the French text, it's very strange, time itself precisely. Yet history and time are not the same thing, and we will not be surprised to see in the next few pages of the book of Derrida the name and the shadow of Heidegger reappearing instead of Marx. Fourth point. How can we think of the revolutionary event in a way other than a parody? And yet to remain with Marx within history. The whole challenge of the other possible side of spectrality will consist precisely in determining a form of relationship to history, and prior to that, a representation of history itself, that at the same time allows for a recognition of present determinations, on the one hand, and what Marx calls the poetry of the revolution, its poetic power, its constituent power, on the other. At the same time, because it is not a question of playing the former against the possibility of the latter, but of thinking about their articulation. In the 18th Brumaire, the linguistic metaphorization of this difficulty allows Marx to be particularly clear. I quote, "In like manner, the beginner who has learned a new language always translates it back into his mother tongue. But he assimilates the spirit of the new language and expresses himself freely in it only when he moves in it without recalling the old and when he forgets his native tongue." In short, if there is a possibility of revolution, it is not so much because we have learned the words and know how to curse. I'm thinking here to Caliban in The Tempest. "You taught me language, and my profit is I know how to curse," and so on. It is that we have both learned and been able to forget, to free the newness of the revolutionary event. "Let the dead bury their dead," says Marx. So that the social revolution of the 19th century can finally achieve its own content. And yet, this novelty would not be possible without what it precisely exceeds and overflows, denies, and disarticulates: the present with which it breaks. This is a point that Derrida sees perfectly. I quote Derrida, "For what one must forget will have been indispensable," end of quote. If we do not forget enough, we are doomed to periodic repetition. But if we forget too much, If we do not remember the spirit of the revolution, then, I quote, the result is bourgeois platitude. The expression is one of Marx. This is the ridge line along which we must forge a path. In Derrida's commentary, the ridge line takes on a specific form. The unleashed overflowing, the French expression is powerful, ce déferlement par-dessus bord, is indeed what embodies the excess of novelty, this proper content of the social revolution that Marx longs for. But there is also the condition in which we find ourselves, caught between the two regimes of spectrality that I have tried to describe. Quote, one does not know if the expectation prepares the coming of the future to come, or if it recalls the repetition of the same thing as ghost, Derrida remarks. But he immediately adds, this not knowing is not a lacuna. No progress of knowledge could saturate an opening that must have nothing to do with knowing, nor therefore with ignorance. In reality, Derrida's position, defined by reference to the reading of Marx, is interesting because it outlines in its own way a thought of what we call the possible difference in historical context, with at least three characteristics. One, revolution is a horizon of expectation marked by uncertainty. If horizon of expectation sounds too Koselekian, we can no doubt understand the insistent proposal of Specters of Marx of a messianism without Mashiach. This is Derrida. Messianisme sans Messie. This is exactly the expectation. Second point, second consequence. We cannot reduce and claim to manage the expectation through the sole dimension of knowledge. History should not only be known, it should be made, acted. Third, what we inherit, our history, must not be able to impose that the parodic spectrality saturates the field of possibilities. For that reason, we must remember not only the bad ghosts, but also the good ones. Those who remind us that inheritance is never a given, it's always a task. L'héritage n'est jamais un donné, c'est toujours une tâche, says Derrida. The task escapes as indeterminacy, as openness, a kind of knowledge by anticipation that would settle in the register of prediction. We could just as well say a discourse that would belong to the exclusive mode of logical determination, to the naive belief in a simple causality, and which would be nothing more than the scientific dressing up of the old practice of prophecy. And yet, this exceedance, nevertheless, has to do with something that has happened. This something that has happened can be a date, for example, 1848, a phenomenon, for example, the history of capitalism or the history of liberalism at the turn of 18th and 19th centuries, or that of neoliberalism in its contemporary reformulations and adaptations. It can also be a name. For us, the name of Marx, of course, but also perhaps the name of Derrida today. Now, this something that has happened is, Derrida tells us about Marx, a legacy that paradoxically demands as a pledge of extreme fidelity to be thought of not as a given, but as a task, like a discrepancy, a shift between the spontaneous idea that we have of the spectre as a revenant, something that returns from the past to haunt our own present and determine the contours of our future. And another completely different idea, according to which the spectre is the result of a process of transformation, of transfiguration, which means that what returns in reality does not return because it cannot be the same. It has just been made. The idea of this discrepancy, of this shift, emerges as a surprise in Derrida's own reflection and seems to burst in almost by force in his analysis. At least that what Derrida himself says, I quote, when in 1847, 1848, Marx names the spectre of communism, he inscribes it in a historical perspective that is exactly the reverse of the one I was initially thinking of in proposing a title such as The Specters of Marx, where I was tempted to name thereby the persistence of a present past, the return of the dead, which the worldwide work of Moring cannot get rid of, whose return it runs away from, which it chases, excludes, banishes, and at the same time pursues. Marx, for his part, announces and calls for a presence to come. Marx also considers the spectre as a vector of the future. Fifth point, last one. This brings me to the final point of my commentary. 173 years separate us from Marx's text. 32 years separate us from Derrida's text. The world has changed, and it is no longer Marx's world, nor probably not completely Derrida's world. However, there is a third regime of spectrality to be added to the two that emerged from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which I have just briefly outlined. This third regime of spectrality is precisely that of Marx himself. Because what we are fighting against is a spectral return of Marx frozen in the successive parodies of which his name has been the mask, or stuck in a dehistoricization that we would subject his thought to under the guise of fidelity. Thoughts of the party, thoughts of the state form, thought of a certain reality of labor, of a certain theory of value, of a certain class. What do we put in place of all that for today? I insist, for today. It is probably necessary to ensure that, as Derrida himself notes, if, since Marx names a future to come as much as a past, the past of a proper name, it is because the proper of a proper name will always remain to come, and secret. Here, perhaps, we are entitled to discuss secret or Marx's extraordinary ability to foresee the necessity of his own future historicization. To put it more simply, a figure forever missing in the carpet and yet always proven with each reaffirmation of the heritage, the Marxism, an insistence from the very depth of the heterogeneity of what he is constantly changing, and the reaffirmation of a strange invariant emerging from the spectrality of the spectre, or, on the contrary, the idea that the opening up of history is an ever-present virtuality, an ever-possible bifurcation, which means that it has, of course, to do with the stratifications of what we call reality, which is at once an effect of present determinations and past stratifications. But that it also points out the work of difference from within its very meshes. Therefore, necessarily, our need to promote Marx beyond Marx, with the specters of Marx returning to haunt our own time and demanding of us precisely something like a task in order to allow us access to the legacy. All this requires us to make a new diagnosis of our present, a new critique, using new categories and with new leverage points. Deconstruction, from this point of view, is not a thing, nor a method. It is, like Marx thought itself, since they finally have that in common, an infinite task, a practice, ceaselessly taking up its own movement and working it like dough, like the material of an endless elaboration.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith, for that marvelous paper. So, I think there's another specter that haunts your paper, and that was Nietzsche. And of course, you made references to Nietzsche subtly when you referred to monumental history, or when you referred to breaking the revolutionary idol. So he was there. But I think that it would be helpful to bring his specter a little bit into view in thinking about these questions of the role of history and the relationship of past to futures and the role of memory in that. So I was hearing him. I was hearing others as well, who I'll talk about later, maybe when we end our session. But I thought that would have been helpful to think about. I mean, it's very present in your paper, but it helps bring some additional things to light. I totally agree with you, I think, that the spectrality for Marx is different than the spectrality for Derrida. And I definitely agree with you when you write that with Derrida, the ambiguity is greater than with Marx. And in a way, I mean, my question would be, if we needed to use another word than spectrality to try and get at some of these questions, particularly with Marx, what would that word be? In other words, if we needed to shift to another metaphor, what would that be? Because in a way, it almost feels to me with the deconstructive work of Derrida that we lose a little bit of the thread of spectrality and what it's trying to achieve. So, and I want to pick up on this, on your insistence that we do this all for today, and so that we figure this out, in part because the whole purpose of this seminar, Marx 1313, is to return to Marx as a way to help us do what you speak about: a new diagnosis of our present, a new critique, new categories, and new leverage points. And in part, And in part, it's a return to Marx because my sense is that in this moment, it's particularly, that you can get particular leverage from that return, spectral, perhaps. And sometimes I feel as if I'm getting less leverage out of a return to deconstruction, which is what you're suggesting at the end, is helping you understand the present or providing. And so I'd like to know more about that. In what way you're thinking that deconstruction is helping you with this kind of, with the new diagnosis, new critique, new categories, and new leverage points. So do you want to say a word about that, and then we'll try and open it up and put the two papers in conversation?
Very quickly, well, first thing, you mentioned Nietzsche. The amazing thing is that the Intempestive Considerations is wrote has been written more than 30 years after Marx's text. So it's a pre-Nietzschean consideration. It's quite strange. What could be a metaphor or another word instead of spectrality? I think Marx uses the metaphor of the language, which is quite useful. The image of the mother tongue. If you want to learn another language, you have to, in a first time, translate the new language into the one you already knew, and then you have to free yourself then from this mother tongue. And it's quite useful for politics, I think. We have to free ourselves from models that we needed and actually we need, but we have to move on. And we have to move on because our present is not the past, and it's new. And so if we are not able to say exactly for what reason, in what dimension the present is new, we are not able to produce a diagnosis and a critique and to act into the present. And last point, you said the goal of the entire series on Marx is to return to Marx in order to help us to understand and act in the present. I don't know if I would say return to Marx. What I'm interested in is more put Marx at work, which is quite different. Because some of the categories of Marx are shaped in a time, in a history, which is not ours anymore. I mean, peasantry. What is a peasant today, for example? Or even the bourgeois order. What is bourgeoisie nowadays? How you define bourgeoisie? Are PhD students bourgeois, for example? It's a real question. In relation to the figure of a worker, maybe, but how to define a bourgeois today? It's not a matter of, I mean, I don't want to say that Marx is wrong now or lost his efficiency. I want to say that the world moved, and so we have to adapt our categories and analysis to this new we have to think. So put Marx at work, for me, means that shift. And it's like Marx beyond Marx. What is work? What is labor today? What is value today? What is the link between value and time, which is so fundamental for Marx in the Capital? I mean, with this thing, I'm at work 24 all the day and the night. I'm still working, even when I sleep and dream. So I don't, I'm not able to distinguish, for example, working time and living time. It's the same thing. It's a biopolitical dimension. This is, for me, today, these kind of questions are Marxian. So return to Marx, I don't know, put Marx at work.
Okay, yeah, so that was, yeah. Okay, so I would modify that then slightly. I think return to Marx was too simple a statement, clearly, obviously. So rereading Marx, and then I would say rereading Marx not to put Marx to work, but to put us to work, in a way.
Yeah.
Right?
You're right.
I think that's what we're doing, in a way. I mean, or that's what I think this seminar is about. It's about rereading Marx to put us to work through kind of confrontation, contradiction. And then in that context, then I take it, history and the relationship of the present to the actuality, to how we understand the actuality, and to how we might transform the actuality. So the three temporal specters of history are key. Now, Guillaume, I mean, in part, that's what you were doing, I think, as well, right? Which was trying to reread le 18 Brumaire, putting it in conversation with Said, but trying to make us work on the question of how to understand the support that is the popular support for a movement towards an authoritarian leader, in a way to try and understand a popular democratic support for a movement away from democracy, in a way, or democratic processes. So how then did you hear the kind of the three specters, and how does it help inform your work?
Thank you very much. To be in discussion with Judith, with this category of spectre. And I think that there is perhaps something as a common point in our two readings of 18th Brumaire. That's the bridge I see between your analysis of the category of spectre and my own reflection on the fact that Marx considers as obvious that the small peasants don't represent themselves, but are always represented by someone who appears as a mastery. And in fact, for me, it's a double question. First, I would say it's a question of how can we propose a diagnosis in terms that involve something as a rupture between what is and what is to be. in terms of a rupture between a description and a prescription. We all know that it is one of the biggest problems in philosophy. For example, by David Hume's reflection, how can we give a norm if we first take into consideration a description? And in a certain sense, speaking of Spectre and speaking of some people that don't represent themselves, in both cases, it involves a kind of prescription. Not the same, perhaps, but a kind of prescription. It's obvious for my part, I think, when we tell that people do not represent themselves, the question that we have to put into question is, who are we to take as obvious the fact that the people do not represent themselves, do not speak from their own voice in a kind of way? We are some ventriloquists who speak for the people, considering by advance that they don't speak by their own voice. And in a certain sense, it's the same problem with Spectre. It's a question of visibility. A ghost is a revenant. It appears as a ghost, but it has not the sizes and the shape of a true body that can assert by himself, okay, I'm here now and I have to tell something. It's already a question of social ontology or political ontology to consider that someone has to be a revenant or will not have a possibility to speak by himself. So for me, the question would be, if I had to put Marx into work nowadays, to consider at first that one thing is the fact that people do speak by themselves, do appear by themselves. But secondly, it's always, we have at the same time to take into consideration the fact that perhaps having the power, using the power, consists in the possibility to consider that some people are only ghosts, specters, or do not represent themselves. And it will be a critical task to perhaps to put into brackets this consideration and to try to make obvious that the people have their own voice, even if this voice doesn't go in the direction we would like that it goes.
Before Judith asks you to respond to that, let me just clarify one thing. When we say, for instance, when we say they don't represent themselves, I'm trying to grasp what that means today. I mean, clearly, I understand well Marx's distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself, and the long history of the controversy over those categories. But when we speak about it today, is it that, in fact, what we're trying to say is that it's a representation of self that actually negates the democratic potential of self-representation in a way? So would it be something like someone who supports Donald Trump at this moment is in fact, I mean, fully representing themselves, and then we can have whole questions about consciousness of class and whatnot. But at the individual level, is it that there there is a lack of self-representation in the sense that it is the endorsement of a form of absolutist executive power that doesn't allow for, well, that doesn't allow for democratic decision making, but increasingly becomes a form of, you know, unified executive power done through executive orders that are stripping all other institutions and unifying all decision-making power in a single executive in a single executive represented by a single person. Is that what we have in mind, or do we have something else in mind in terms of the idea that someone is not representing themselves, right?
I think that we have a double answer, and I think we cannot, at the moment, choose between the two answers. Which one is available? First answer would be to consider that nowadays, when if someone is supporting Donald Trump, for instance, yes, he does. He gives his voice to someone who appears having the power to represent his own voice. So that we could say, in a sense of Marx, that these people who gave a voice to Marx, to Trump, it's not the same. These people who gave the voice to Trump, in fact, are represented more than they represent. It could be a kind of answer to understand the discrepancy between the voice of a leader and the lackness of voice of people who always consider that their voice is not taken into consideration, and so on and so on. And in France also there is a big, a kind of political description relative to the Front Rassemblement National, the party of Marine Le Pen, because she has perfectly understood that she has created her own discourse as I am the voice of the voiceless. And she has constructed a narration of a social world in terms that she gives voice to the voiceless people that don't feel that they are represented, apprehended, recognized, so that they build what Pierre Rosanvallon called a parliament of the invisible. And of course, we clearly see that constructing other narrations in terms of having the possibility that the people feel that they are represented in their jobs, in the way they appear in the world is very, very important because of this construction, of this political construction. That will be a first answer. Of course, people, one of the lessons, social lessons of precariousness is the fact that that the excluded people feel as obvious the fact that their own voice is precarized, and that therefore should be taken into consideration by a voice, a strong voice that could represent the lackness of voice. That would be a first answer. But I say there are two answers, and I very shortly gave a second one because it seems to me that it is a very important one. The second answer would be to consider the distinction, to return to Marx in a sense, and to consider the distinction of two kinds of classes, a conservative one and a revolutionary one. Perhaps what appears now is the affirmation more and more constructed by the hegemonic forms of power of a conservative class. And I mean that we could also interpret the support of Donald Trump as a way to assert a conservative way of seeing the world, by contrast to a revolutionary way of seeing, for example, the economic divisions of the 1% and the other people. So I think the answer is in between, and we don't know at the time the end of this match between these two answers.
Okay. Judith, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I can. Well, I was thinking about the fact that I was very interested in what Guillaume said, because this question of small peasants don't represent themselves and so on is exactly what I would give as an example of when I say heritage is a task and not something which has to do with fidelity or I don't know. Because when we say small peasants don't represent themselves, we say, and Guillaume said it before, they don't access a certain regime of visibility first. But Marx would say they are not able to be conscious of themselves as a class. They don't see themselves as a class. My question is, what is the concept of class for Marx, and what is the concept of class for us today? And I think they are totally different. It's not the question. To say, it's not a matter to say Marx is wrong. It's just because history changed. So my question would be, for example, at the very heart of the Marxian concept of class, and maybe it is still our concept, there is a condition. And this condition, the class has to be one, a unity. And the peasants are not able to constitute themselves as a unity. This is 80s Brumaire, no? My question would be, are we sure that social subjects nowadays have to be or have to represent themselves as a unity? I hear the discourse of unity in Trump discourse. I will represent all the people, blah, blah, blah. I hear it when he designed the enemy. The enemy are the movie, the intellectuals, the universities, LGBT. And it's a way to indicating the enemy to shape the unity of its own part. My question is, what happens if we try to think about subjects of class without this precondition of unity, which is typically a modern condition, I mean, from Hobbes on. And I was thinking about it because in, I don't know if you know it, but in France we had some years ago the yellow jacket phenomenon. And the yellow jackets were very interesting because they were not presenting any unity. I mean, the unity was the unity of the space they invested, of the things they did. They were acting, but they were not homogeneous as a subject of class. They were women, men, young, old, retired, occupied, and so on. So the unity was, to end my point, I was remembering that Thomas Hobbes says, the multitude is not able to unify itself. He needs for this kind of gesture from the sovereignty, which gives unity and transform the multitude into people. And my question is, maybe our problem today is using Marx and put Marx at work, and us too, to try to define the condition in which a collective subject, as a class, as a political subject, can represent himself, itself, oneself, not as a unified subject. Nationalism say you are unified. Fascism says you are unified. Trump says my people are. Oh, this is a great problem. The people in English is plural. We say le peuple est, which is quite easier. You say people are, which is strange for us. But the language of unity, let me say, people is, even if it's not normal. The language of unity is the language of fascism.
Although it's interesting that in French it's a singular, le peuple, right? Le peuple est, yeah, which would be. Yeah, let me, go ahead.
Just very shortly a point.
Could you pass the mic over to yes,
what Judith said? Really, I do agree with you, Judith. And just a point, because I was thinking on one of discussion of Michel Foucault on Marx, and when he says in this question of lutte des classes, struggle of classes, the question is more perhaps the question of a struggle than the question of classes. I mean, we have forgotten this question of struggle. Perhaps one big benefit of a description of Marx is to conceptualize what is a struggle in terms of social war between two classes. And perhaps the question will be, if we don't have this possibility of a struggle allowed by the category of class, what do we have instead? I think that instead, nowadays, we have hate, we have discontent, we have resentment, but one of the big benefits of Marx reading Struggle of Class is that we have to return to an operative affirmation of the positivity of the struggle. And this point, for me, is very important. And I'm just wondering, if we forget this question of class, can we return to an operative concept of struggle?
Great question. All right, go ahead. We're going to have 3 comments. Go ahead first.
Hello.
And introduce yourself, please.
My name's Laura. I guess my question concerns the thread between the 2 papers, and that is the foundation of democratic ideal, which you brought up for a moment, connecting Derrida's in Specters of Marx, the autoimmunity of democracy, in which democracy can upend itself through the very democratic process, as we've seen with the recent election, and the question of representation. I don't know if it's obvious to me that people know what their interests are, or rather that they are looking for someone that represents their interests. And that's a question that I've thought of when it comes to making sense of the election results, and just of what people find attractive in an authoritarian leader in general. And I think it's the ability to pass on that question to somebody else and be kind of taken care of, which is a desire that not everyone relates to, but is a particular desire that a lot of people want. And so that question of interest is interesting to me, because part of the democratic ideal and what is supposed to be attractive about it is externalizing one's own identity in the world of action, and this idea of self-actualization through others and through this representational framework. But if you see things like the way that neoliberals, I'm thinking of people from the Mont Pelerin Society, and the way that they are very anti-democratic, or even like neo-monarchists. They don't speak kindly of democracy. They're looking for that. They're not, this is not a value that they hold highly. And I don't know if it's something that going into the future, democracy, I mean, is something that's going to be relevant. Like, I guess the foundational values, which has, supported it thus far. I don't really have an answer. I was just putting it out there.
Thanks. Could you pass the mic down to Abba? 1, 2, 3.
Thanks. Now I have to remember what I wanted to say.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Abha, and I'm...
Speak well into the mic.
Excuse me. I'm Abha. I'm a PhD researcher in the Geneva Graduate Institute, and so just I was also going to... I was very happy to hear about the Gilets jaunes, because that's a kind of an important point that I also wanted to make, was that they're kind of not... There is no specific unity tying them together, and actually I think in many of their discussions they actively avoid speaking about politics or who to vote for, because they view it as something that is divisive to their goals, and their goals were kind of very, just for the purpose of the room, very concrete, in the sense that they were asking for sort of more public services and better taxes and etc. And so I think also there's a different idea of class consciousness there, in the sense that they also do not want to be associated to a class of being sort of assisté, like they're not wanting to... I don't know if that's my correct reading of how things have played out in France. And so, but there's also a lot of like racism in the Gilets jaunes. A lot of their concerns are like minorities and this kind of thing. And so I wonder if you think that... I mean, I think that the race-class intersection here is really interesting, especially in the French context, and whether by kind of virtue of social spatial segregation and socio-spatial apartheid, I'm thinking of banlieues, etc., classes kind of emerge. I'm saying this very, very generally. Please take everything with a pinch of salt. Classes kind of emerge on the basis of, as you say, shared experience and struggle, and also dispossession and alienation, heavily policed violence, etc. So just open that can of worms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Let's get. I see two more comment. David, did you want to say something? Pass it, David, and then we'll have a final round from our guests. Go ahead.
Hi. Hi, I'm David. I'm at the law school here in Columbia, and I think I wanted to go back to what you said about Hobbes. And I wonder if we're still talking about representation, or if it's more a question of imagination. Hobbes worked very well with visual strategies, and I think one of his main aspects here was that he created a Leviathan precisely because he knew logically he had to go somewhere else. He had to ground it in not logical cognition, but sensual cognition to make it make sense. Is this maybe something that we have to take into consideration when we speak about representation, that it's more a question of what do you see? Les Petits Paysans, par exemple, they were so far from each other that imagining a unity was so much more difficult than seeking the unity in one very, very precise model like the executive that has been having a long tradition in history before. And now to kind of triangulate that with another reading of Marx, now we're more conscious about how images work and how they work epistemologically on our way of creating knowledge. To use here maybe Debord's take, the spectacle, right? It's not a collection of images, it's a social relation mediated through images.
Okay, thanks, David. And then one more quick intervention.
Hi everyone, my name is Eklavya. I'm doing international criminal law, LLM here. Maybe 10 years back, I went to office of Marxist Party in India, and I asked them, I want to join, I want to read Marxism. So they asked my caste, and they told me, no, you can't. I mean, the question was like, you can't do that. So basically, what I see in my country, that leadership is very, very monopolized in casteist line, and most of the Marxists, so-called Marxists, they are caste brother and sisters also, and they have never done any job in life, I mean in agriculture or labor job, pure labor work. Like yesterday I was reading about the Simone Wevel of France, that she left everything, she went to the factory and she had a very tough life. And I was wondering why did this kind of thing never happen in my country, and they're very much, they always try to appropriate. And due to that reason, people have a very negative approach against Marxist leader in my part of the world. And now when this kind of people, like they have developed a kind of entrepreneur model of hypocrisy. Same group, at one level they will be left wing, when they will go to Silicon Valley, they will become right wing, when they will be in academia, they will become a different wing. Then they, just like a kind of entrepreneur model to appropriate power or play with the power. I believe, and I see every time, every day, they look down upon you, and something like that. And due to that reason, I believe, if you look at the right wing now, the right wing is addressing the class question in better way than the left wing. And this is the perception, this is how it is happening in many parts of the world. If you look at the labor class, who is, those who are poor, those who are landless, those who are suffering in tremendous way, they may have consciousness or they may not have consciousness, but reality is that they are supporting Trump or they are supporting Modi in my country. Why this is happening, and this is the real question.
Thank you. Okay, all right, so we have 4 huge areas to discuss and 1 minute left. So we've got questions about how do we define interests and how does it relate to democracy? Questions about the intersection with race and particularly the relationship with the banlieue in France, but similarly in the United States. The question of caste as well, and forms of exclusion that in a way are perhaps feeding into some of this movement to the right, and then questions of the relationship between representation and imagination, and the role of images and what we see. Okay, so that's a lot to cover in now 30 seconds. So maybe Guillaume, you can have, and the reason is also that we need to end because there's something a lot more important than this seminar that we have to celebrate, but in a minute. But Guillaume, why don't you give us one 1 minute worth, and then
very
Judith, 1 minute worth. Sorry.
Yeah, very difficult to answer to your brilliant reflections, but perhaps very quickly for your last question, why is it happening? It's a real question. You said. I think you're right, but I think it will be also a way to put into relation with your first question on democracy. I think what we took as granted, a certain idea of democracy, that means that people have their own voice. We consider as obvious the fact that they take into consideration their voice in the sense of a general interest. Some reflections due to Rousseau, for instance, are no more available today. The concept of democracy itself the normative presuppositions of what we call democracy are no more available. And this is a first point that we have to question. How can it, for example, yes, we can return to Tocqueville, democracy on America. All the categories that he has put into evidence are no more available now. And the fact, for example, that the question of truthness is a strong question for democratic arguments is put into brackets regarding the question of belief that becomes more important than now the question of truth. So that I think the different arguments of the citizenship who regards the general interest, the question of truth, which is more important than the question of belief, are no more effective to define and to defend the value of democracy. And that's our problem now. That's I would like to say from my point of view, yes.
Thank you.
Judith? Yeah, no, last. The limit of Marx thought for me, but not the limit of a possible use of Marx. And I do hope you will see it next week with Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra, is that Marx still believed that in order to have class struggle, you need a class subject. And so the precondition for the struggle is a subject. And I was wondering if maybe we can reverse the logical sequence and say what we call subject or class subject is not the precondition of the struggle, but the effect of the struggle in itself. And more generally, the effect of every kind of practice which is shared. Foucault, l'amitié, friendship, it's a kind of practice. Modes of life, practices, and so on. So if you think class subject as an effect and not a precondition, is it Marx? I think it's a certain reading of Marx, but it's not Marx, but it's Marx beyond Marx. So this is my, and for the problem of race, just 2 seconds, I remember a meeting with Etienne Balibar and the people of the banlieue and the Yellow Jackets at the very beginning of the phenomenon of the Yellow Jackets. And from the banlieue, they said, we don't participate to the demonstrations on Saturday because there is too many police. Just the thing. It's not because we are outside or because we are considered as racialized and not part of this kind of subject. And it's because it's dangerous for us. It's more dangerous for us than for white people, for example. So it was very cheap, but real as explanation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And on the Gilets jaunes, I just want to say, actually, we had a great seminar in 1313 with Tony Negri and Etienne Balibar and Ludivine Bottini, yeah, on that. So I'll get that to you. Sorry, just remembering now. Okay, now there was another specter in the talk that has resurfaced a few times, and that's Tony Negri. Because and the references to Marx beyond Marx that we keep on thinking about, and that, of course, is the segue to next week's Marx 9:13, when we will have Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra, and we will be reading not only Marx's Grundrisse, but of course Tony Negri's remarkable lectures on the Grundrisse, Marx beyond Marx. So that's going to be next week on Wednesday, and I hope you'll join us for that. I want to give a big round of thanks for Ricardo for making this all possible, Reno for all the AV work. Thank you so much. And of course, Guillaume and Judith for incredible papers and for blessing us with this conversation and this rich conversation. Now, as I was saying, much more important than all of this is the fact that we now need to celebrate and congratulate Janai Levita, Dr. Janai Levita, who just defended her dissertation this afternoon while we were in seminar and joined us for the seminar afterwards. And so we have some champagne, and I invite you all to toast Janai, Dr. Janai Levita now, all right? Congratulations. So we're gonna pop the champagne, right now. Here we go.